turn with me in your Bible or follow along on the TV screens up front in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. We're in chapter 10 once more. We'll take verses 23 through 33 today and finish out the chapter and finish out this particular topic. What topic might that be? Does anyone remember? Oh, I'm sure you couldn't forget. And that would be the topic of Christian liberties and or Christian rights. The Apostle Paul has brought us right back to that in chapter 10, verse 23. Indeed, he never really has left that topic. I've shared that with you before. He gave us chapter 8 about Christian liberties, chapter 9 about Christian rights. And then at the end of chapter 9, it seemed like Paul went off into a different line of conversation, but it's when we get to verse 23 that we realize for sure, Paul never really left the topic of Christian liberties. What he was doing was building his case so that he could teach us more about this topic of Christian liberty. So we come right back to that. For this final section, I'm going to use the word Christian liberties a lot, or maybe sometimes just the word liberties. And I do just want to remind you that when I use that word, there's a whole lot of stuff behind that word. When I say Christian liberties, I am also referring to non-essentials of the faith, disputable matters, matters of opinion, matters of difference, preferentials, gray areas, all of those things. Those are all included when I use that word, Christian liberties, because it really truly is handled all the same. It is always going to be those same operative principles anytime we're dealing with any of that stuff. So I'm just going to call them Christian liberties more than likely for ease of conversation here, so I don't have to keep going into that long list. But you know that's what Paul is talking about here in the last section of this chapter. If you are tired of hearing about this topic, then just give me these 11 verses more for today, and then we're done with it for a very long time. We're done with it until we come to Colossians. Paul will talk about it in Colossians once again, but he'll handle that much more concisely in Colossians. So by the time we're done today, we have done the full workshop on this topic of Christian liberties to the extent that once we finish up today, you guys really should be like experts on all things Christian liberties. And you should really be able to lead the charge out there in the Christian world when it comes to these things. When it comes to how we apply, making sure we don't misapply, how we manage, making sure we don't mismanage these things, Christian rights, Christian liberties, differences of opinions that we hold, freedoms that we exercise as Christians, because sadly, most churches do not get this kind of teaching. I know you've been glutted on a little bit because we spent 3 chapters in Romans 14 on it, 3 teachings in Romans 14 on it, 2 or 3 teachings in Romans chapter 8, 2 or 3 in Romans 9. We've had a couple now in chapter 10, and it's all been about really this same set of issues. But most Christians do not get that level of instruction on this topic like you do. In fact, most Christians never hear about this stuff because their topical pastor doesn't choose these topics. So they don't hear about it. They're not well educated on it. So just remember that when you're out there among other Christians. Anchored Fellowship knows about these things. We thank God that He has opened our understanding to these things and that we can teach them very plainly. But not all Christians can say that. You're going to have to keep that in mind. You're going to see other Christians violating the things that Paul teaches us. It's going to become very obvious to you they don't know what Jesus taught about this stuff. They don't know how Paul applied this stuff. And you're going to have to just be the educator in that situation. Not that you should be puffed up with pride. That was one of the warnings Paul gave us in this section of chapters. Not that you would be puffed up in pride over the knowledge you do have on this stuff. That you would be humble and that you would be helpful to other Christians to kind of lead the charge in all of this, to instruct them so that they might know these things as well. Now, since it's a topic that we have spent a considerable portion of the year covering, I'm going to just go ahead and forego an extended introduction. I don't really think we need it. I would rather just hit the ground running and finish up this, I guess, Paul's final touches on the topic of Christian liberty. So let's go ahead and do that, beginning our scripture reading at verse 23, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 23. Paul says, "All things are lawful, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful, but not all things build up." All right, so it's pretty obvious we're back to the topic of Christian liberties, right? If you don't believe it just from that statement, you can go ahead and peek down a handful of verses to verse 29, and you can underline the word liberty. All right, that's where you'll see that word popping into this chapter, making it very clear to us that Paul's not just talking about meat that's been offered to idols. That will be his example, as it usually is, because it was easiest for him to teach us these principles by using that example of meat offered to idols. But you see that word liberty, you understand this applies across the board to all of these things. And yes, Paul is right back on that topic of Christian liberties. If you need more proof of that, you get that in the very first statement of verse 23, where the Apostle Paul says, "All things are lawful." That statement is not true in any other context except for the context of Christian liberties. It is not true in any other context except for the context of Christian liberties. Just think about that. Just think that out principally, right? Is it lawful for a Christian to lie, cheat, steal, and murder? Is it lawful for a Christian to transgress the Ten Commandments? Is it lawful for Christians to ignore the teachings and the commandments of Christ? Is it lawful for us to do that just because, well, we're Christians and we are free in Jesus? Is all of that stuff lawful for us? Of course not. Of course it's not lawful for us. Verse 23 is only true in the context of Christian liberties. If the Bible condemns something, this teaching is going to start to sound a little familiar to you. If the Bible condemns something, then that is unlawful for you, the Christian. But in the matter of those things where the Bible does not condemn or the Bible does not fully settle issues, topics, opinions, not fully settled by the Bible, those are areas where we can have different opinions and where we can exercise our liberties in different ways. Now, once again, do not ignore the fact that Paul said all things are lawful. We know he's not talking about all things as a blanket statement, a standalone statement. He's talking about all of those things that are Christian liberties for us, all of those things that actually apply as being legitimate Christian liberties. And he makes that statement that all things, all of those liberties are lawful to you, and he really means that. He really means that. He's reinforcing that. He is not making hard set rules here or laws for how you have to govern your Christian liberties. That's not what Paul is doing. Even Paul won't do that. He is acknowledging your liberties right there. All of these liberties are lawful for you. And now, building on that, Paul is then going to teach us that just because you're allowed by God to do something, to exercise some liberty, to practice something that the Bible is not directly clear about, that does not mean that it is necessarily the best opinion or the best practice. Yes, all things are lawful for us, but not all things build up or edify, as is seen in some versions. So this is a bit of a jumping off point for us. I believe Paul starts with this: all true Christian liberties are lawful for you. So you are welcome to exercise them, but not all true Christian liberties, when you put them into practice, are edifying to you personally. We need to apply it personally first, but we pay attention to where Paul is going with this, and it only makes sense because it's difficult to talk about self-edification and not give consideration for how that impacts the collective, the church. So we think about self-edification. Does this liberty self-edify? Is it helpful and beneficial to me spiritually? But then we don't want to stop there. We want to ask the question, well, what about edification on the collective level? Let's consider that too. Ditch the things that don't build you up in your faith personally, but don't stop there. What about situations where something is self-edifying, but it is not collectively edifying to the church? What if it builds you up, but it tears down the church? What if it's having a positive spiritual impact on you, but a negative spiritual impact on Christians around you? What do you do in situations like that? And Paul is going to go on to tell us now. He's going to give us the collective interpretation of edification and what that means in the practical exercising of our liberties. Verse 24, let no one seek his own good, but the good of his neighbor. So now, we do have to be careful with statements like this. Paul is employing what we would call antithesis, which is meant to be a sharp contrast between two different ideas. A statement of antithesis is only intended to highlight a better choice without completely condemning the other choice. Jesus is our example of this. Jesus taught at times using antithesis. The one that came to my mind in study is John chapter 6, verse 27, where Jesus said, labor not for that meat which perishes, but for that meat which endures to everlasting life. That's a statement of antithesis. It's supposed to champion one choice as being more important than the other without completely discrediting the other. That one's pretty easy to understand, right? Because if it were unlawful, according to Jesus, if it were a sin for us to work to buy the food that perishes, the earthly food that we need to sustain our mortal frames, well, then every Christian would end up dying of starvation. Either that or we'd need a miracle manna provision from the Lord. And even that, we'd be in trouble because you still got to go work to collect it off of the ground like the nation of Israel did, right? So if he's saying it's a sin for you to work for meat that perishes, it's only appropriate for you to work for that meat, that food, that sustenance that is eternal, we'd be in trouble. Obviously, it's a statement of antithesis. All he's saying is one of these choices is much more important than the other. That's what Paul is doing with this statement here. It doesn't mean that seeking your own good is somehow wrong or that it's a sin, only that it is the less important choice of the two. You are absolutely going to need to seek your own well-being in life and in your Christian life. You're going to need to do that. And you do it all the time, in fact. You pray for blessing, you pray for direction, you pray for healing, you pray for protection, you pray for provision from God. What are you doing in all of those cases? You're seeking your own well-being, and that's important. Why do you attend church? You're seeking your own well-being. Nothing wrong with any of that, but that is the less important choice when it comes to the church setting. The more important one is going to be the well-being of others. And he uses the word neighbors here, and Paul is most definitely referring to your Christian neighbors, the people sitting by you in church service. None of this applies to folks outside of the church. We're talking about Christian neighbors here. So if others are being hurt or offended in the process of you exercising or practicing a liberty, well, then you done messed up, right? You done messed up. You did it wrong. You managed that liberty incorrectly. I shared a story with you before as we were previously visiting this topic. And I want to bring that story back because there's been an update to that story. And it's very important because it teaches us exactly what Paul's getting at here. And that was the example that I gave you of a pastor that I know who is very open about exercising his liberty to drink alcohol, and how he would go out with his wife, regular basis. This happens all the time. He'll go out to dinner with his wife, and they're celebrating something, and they'll take pictures of the dinner table, and there's their glasses of wine, or there's their beer, or they're holding it up and doing a cheers, whatever. They're very open about exercising that liberty, and I shared that story with you, and I commended him that it seemed he had his church well enough taught that none of them were offended by the fact that he does that. But I still offered my pastoral counsel in a situation like that, which would be that he should either abstain from that so that he doesn't offend folks outside of his church, Christians outside of his church, or he needs to practice what Paul taught us in Romans chapter 14, verse 22, that if you have a faith to exercise a liberty like in something like that could possibly be offensive to other Christians, that the best way you should do it is either give it up entirely, or if nothing else, at very least, you exercise that liberty in private, just between you and the Lord, that you don't make a show about it, that you're not in the open about it, because there's always that chance of offending either someone in your fellowship or some Christian outside of your fellowship. You say, what's the big deal about offending Christians outside of our fellowship? Well, for one, if there are Christians outside of the fellowship and we offend them from ever wanting to come and be a part of this fellowship, then they never are going to. We can chase people away from Christ. We can sully his name by doing such things. So that's why it's so important. Well, there's been an update. I found out recently that there actually was a man that attended his church and was extremely offended by his open exercise of that liberty to drink alcohol with his wife. And the reason this guy was so offended, it was a very good reason. It was the fact that he had in the past struggled as an alcoholic. And he had a fight for his life to get over alcohol, to kick that habit. So it bothered him. It bothered him that that would be seen as a recommendation for others from that pastor. Scripturally right, scripturally wrong, didn't matter. He saw that as a very bad recommendation from his pastor. And from what I can tell, this guy handled it completely correctly. He approached the pastor one-on-one. He told them about the problem. He shared, hey, this offends me. I don't think this is good. I don't think this is conveying a good message to folks. I think there's a danger of people getting addicted to alcohol through, your encouragement. And unfortunately, the pastor doubled down on his liberty. He doubled down on that liberty, and he ignored the concern of that member of his own church. And as a result, that member has left his church permanently. So I have to withdraw my commendation. It only seemed like everything was okay there in that situation. It only seemed like all of his folks were fine with that, and none of them were offended by that. Someone was offended by that, and someone left his church over that. And that is exactly the kind of stuff that Paul is teaching us here in this chapter, in this whole, various sections from his writings regarding this topic, that we have to be extremely careful in matters like this. We cannot just dismiss the concerns of how we are exercising our liberties. We have to be very concerned about how those liberties are being perceived by other Christians. We have to be very certain that we are not offending others by the practices that we feel good about. So this was a modern day case in point for everything that Paul has taught us in Romans 14, in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, in 1 Corinthians chapter 9, in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And that's why I shared the example. And why does Paul give so much space to this? He's devoting so much of the space in his letters to teaching these churches these things. Why so? It was a very important issue for them, and it is a very important issue for us still in this modern era. We have to make sure that we get this right. It is very important that we do all that we can in our Christianity to be unnecessarily offensive. There are times where we have to be necessarily offensive. I'm fine with that. If I offend you because I said something straight from the Bible and I taught it just as the Word does, I'm okay with that. It's not as good of a thing for me to offend you because of some opinion that I have or some exercise that I am engaged in my Christianity. So reading on in verse 25, Paul says, "Eat whatever is sold in the meat market." That would be the agora, also known as the shambles. "Eat whatever is sold in the meat market without raising any question on the ground of conscience." Now, as we have well covered, idolatry was very popular in Paul's day, and especially in the city of Corinth. It was sort of a hub for pagan idol worship. There were a bunch of temples there in the city of Corinth, and those temples were just pouring out meat. I mean, it was popular, so all of these people were bringing sacrifices. It worked the same way for these pagans in the first century as it did for the nation of Israel in the Old Testament. The folks would bring their sacrifices. They would offer those animals up as sacrifices to God. And the priest would get a share of that meat so that he could provide support for his family, keep himself alive and healthy. Well, it worked the same way for these pagans in the first century. They got portions of all of the meat that was sacrificed to their false gods, and they ended up inundated with meat. So what they did was they would take and they would make these bulk purchases, or these bulk sales rather, to all of the little shops that would be set up there in the agora, the pagan marketplaces there in Corinth. And it was like a wholesale thing, think Sam's Club and Costco. They would give a bunch of meat to them. They'd pay very little for it, so they were able to turn around and offer that meat at discount prices. So it's pretty obvious that when you went to one of these little shops in the agora, the chances are whatever meat you purchased, that was going to be meat that was previously sacrificed to some false god. And Paul says here, again, who cares? Don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. If you can get a good deal on it, if you can save a couple bucks, go ahead. Don't even think about it. Give no thought to it. Don't ask any questions. Just go in there, buy your meat at discount, cook it up, ask the Lord to bless it, say grace over it, and then scarf it down, and you're just fine. It's basically Paul saying you need a don't ask, don't tell policy for this kind of thing. I know that brings back some negative emotions politically when we hear that, don't ask, don't tell, but it's essentially what this is. Just don't even talk about it. Don't worry about it. The near interpretation for us in the modern day would be when you go to the grocery store to do your shopping, don't even bother looking for the halal sticker. Don't even look for it. Don't even dig into that area of things. Don't even worry about whether that meat was offered up to Allah or not. Doesn't matter. You don't even have to worry about that. When you go into the store, all you have to do is buy it, cook it up, pray the blessing over it, and then scarf it down for the glory of God. That's all you have to do. It's as simple as that. By the way, verse 25, and I really like this. I think it runs really deep here. Verse 25 implies that you are the person that has purchased that meat at the agora. Do you see that? Now really think about this. Think about the implications of that. Paul's telling people who went into the pagan marketplaces and bought their meat, he's telling them, that's fine. It doesn't matter. But listen, think about it. When they pay money to purchase that meat at the pagan marketplaces, where does that money ultimately go? Or at least a portion of it. It goes right back to the pagan temple where that meat was purchased from. They're going to take your money They're going to reinvest it in pagan worship. So in a sense, some of your money could be used to fund pagan worship. Are you surprised Paul would be okay with any of this? Honestly, from my background, I am very surprised that Paul would be okay with this. I would expect Paul to say here, don't you dare give a cent of your money to the agora. That's going right back to temple pagan worship. You really want to support that as a Christian? No, don't do that. That's what I expect Paul to say. But that's not what Paul says. Paul says, pay your money, buy your food. Don't even think about it. Don't even worry about it. So if you extend that principle out a little bit further, this is very illuminating, I think, for us. These principles apply not just to food, not just to drink. This applies to all of our Christian liberties, all of the things that the Bible is not dogmatically clear about. So I'm going to give you an example here that's a little bit modern, and it would be the issue of the things that we watch. Let's look at this as a liberty, because we admit it is a liberty, right? You have to admit that's a disputable area, that's a gray area. Did God ever say in here, thou shalt not have a subscription to Disney Plus? Thou shalt not have a subscription to Netflix. He's not said that. So we can't make those kind of dogmatic stances. We have to be able to take that as a liberty and work all of that out on our own. So what this principle would translate there is that if you purchase with your money a subscription to Netflix or Disney Plus, you are going to have some Christians that will try this whole don't you dare purchase your meat at the agora, because that's going to fund pagan worship. You'll have Christian folks that will do that with your Netflix subscriptions and your Disney Plus subscriptions. They'll tell you all about the stuff that those companies stand for. They'll tell you all about their agendas and what they're trying to push on the American public, and they'll look at you, the Christian, and they'll say, you shouldn't be supporting that. You shouldn't be supporting companies that have these kind of very negative spiritual influences on our country. And what do you do in that situation? Doesn't it feel right to say, yeah, absolutely. Why would I want to give money and help fund a company that has an anti-Christian agenda? All I can tell you is apply the principle that Paul did here. Paul's principle would be, don't worry about it. Don't even think about it. Don't even ask those questions. Hey, if I give you money for this app subscription, where's that money going? What's it funding? Paul says, you don't have to worry about any of that. You don't have to worry about, well, who made that movie? Who made that shirt? What does that company stand for? You don't ever have to go there. Here's what Paul's teaching. You are under no spiritual obligation to do that. You're under no spiritual obligation to worry about what some company or some shop might be doing with the money that you're giving for the things that you want. Maybe you have Netflix and Disney Plus, whatever. I'm using those because those seem to be hot button issues. Maybe you've got these subscriptions and the things that you're watching are good and wholesome for you. All right? So you have to look at this as a situation of that there are actually multiple different sides and angles from which you can come at this. Now, personally, I admit I have done this before. I have banned companies because I don't want to support their agendas. And Paul's not telling you can't do that. You can definitely do that. If you want to ban meat in the pagan marketplace because you don't want to fund the pagan temples, you are absolutely welcome to do that. That's a fine thing. But you don't have to do that. You don't have to even worry about that. That's completely up to you. And I have done that before. I've banned companies. I banned the NFL for a while because I didn't like something they were doing. It helped that the Steelers stunk at the time. but they still stink, and I came back to it because the NFL knocked it off. I have banned companies. I'm not saying I never would in the future. I may do it in the future. You're welcome to do that. I personally really love the concept of go woke, go broke. I love that. I love to think of the power that Christians have, that if we decide we don't like what your company stands for, so we're going to stop buying it, good luck. And then, not long after, that company goes out of business. I'd like to talk about the whole Cracker Barrel thing. That was a little bit different topic, but tradition's important too, apparently, to people. So for meat offered to idols, it would be this: hey, I'm not thrilled about my money supporting idol worship, but I'm going to look at the good in this situation. It's a good thing that folks who don't have a lot of money can go in there and get killer deals on meat. That I can support. Or how about Disney Plus or Netflix? Hey, I may not be thrilled about some of the things that those companies are supporting and pushing, but there are some good things that I can focus on here. There's some good programming in there. Programming that's spiritually edifying to me and to anyone else. And maybe there's a chance that if I will pay my money to stream these things, and enough other Christians will pay them that money to stream those things, maybe at some point they'll actually wake up. They call themselves woke, but they really need to wake up. And maybe at some point they'll follow the money, they'll follow the trends, the streaming trends. They'll wake up, and the Christian, the church, Christians all over the world can help to actually direct the choices they make in their movie productions, in their TV show creations, and in the political matters that those companies back. So there's different angles. That's all I want to point out here. You can do this either way that you choose. It's totally up to you. There are definitely different angles to this. There's something good that can be taken from either one of those approaches. And I have now extracted that principle for you. I've given you a near example. That would be halal, foods that were dedicated to Allah. Big deal, who cares? Those companies can have my money, doesn't matter. I want the food, that's fine, that's all that matters. I'm going to bless the food anyway. I've given you the far example, the more close to home, modern day example of the things that we watch, the subscriptions that we have. And now you can take those principles that Paul has given to us, that I've extrapolated out a little bit, and you can fully extrapolate that out to whatever it is your situation is that you're trying to figure out. You can apply it to your situation. Should I exercise this liberty? Should I have this opinion? Should this be my side of the dispute on this disputable matter? You can apply that however you wish to. You can make the choices that you choose to, as long as you are hearing what Paul is saying about all of this. Verse 26, for the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So this is why you don't have to get bent out of shape over what was done with your meat before it ended up on your table. This is why you don't have to worry about it. Was your meat dedicated to Zeus? Was it dedicated to Allah? Who cares? It does not matter. Who did it belong to before it was dedicated to a false god? That's where Paul goes with this. Who was it dedicated to first? Who owned that food before it got offered up to an idol? God did, the creator of all. That was God's. And whose does it become once again, once you buy it from wherever you buy it, bring it home, cook it up, pray blessing over it, and eat it with thanks to God? Whose does it become once again? God's. So that's the most important thing. Not who was it offered up to when it was sacrificed, but who owned it? Who did it belong to when it was still out in the field standing on four legs? It was God's. And regardless of what happened to it in between, who does it belong to now? You, the Christian, as you eat and live for the glory of God. It's God's once again. And the same goes for any modern day application that you want to make of this as you take this principle and apply it to your liberties. But I will let you flesh that out for yourselves. Now, before we finish here in the last handful of verses, Paul is going to give us this really cool 3-step acid test for helping you to figure out how to manage your liberty. So that's going to be most important. Tune in, to that 3-step test. And that's going to really help us to make sure that we are spot on, pleasing the heart of our Father as we manage the liberties that we exercise. Verse 27. If one of the unbelievers invites you to dinner and you are disposed to go, that means you're dispositioned to want to go. You actually want to go. You know, we talked about the introverts thing earlier. You know, introverts usually don't like dinner invites. They don't want to go. But if you're not an introvert, you want to actually go, then Paul says, eat whatever is set before you without raising any question on the ground of conscience. Now, that's not the same thing as what he taught us in verse 25. Verse 25 teaches you not to bother asking questions about the background or the history of the things that you want to buy for the glory of God. Verse 27 is different in that it says, don't bother asking questions about the background or the history of the food that is gifted to you, the food that is placed on the table from someone else for you to eat. I mean, it would be rude anyway, wouldn't it? Like, well, before I eat, where was this meat from? I got to make sure it's up to my standards. I only eat giant eagle meat. You know, it's a little snobby. You know, none of that Walmart meat around here. It's a little snobby anyway, but verse 25 is for the stuff you're paying for. Verse 27 is for the stuff that's being gifted to you. Paul says, either way, doesn't matter, whatever it was. Someone buys you a gift. You don't have to worry about digging into the company. What's the company label? Let me check this company out. Let me ask that person, well, what's that company stand for that made that product that you're trying to push off to me? I don't want to be defiled by it. What's that company stand for? You don't even have to go there. You don't have to do any of that. You don't have to worry about any of that. You don't have to worry about, does that company promote and support the opposing political party? Because if so, I won't accept the gift. You don't even have to worry about that. You don't have to go there. Sometimes not knowing is best. I know G.I. Joe taught us when we were young that knowing is half the battle. Sometimes not knowing is the absolute best, and ignorance is bliss. Verse 28, but if someone says to you, this has been offered in sacrifice, then do not eat it for the sake of the one who informed you and for the sake of conscience. Verse 29, I do not mean your conscience, but his. Okay, so this is bound to happen. Everything's going along swimmingly and smoothly. You've bought meat that was offered to idols, or someone has bought meat that was offered to idols. They've prepared a meal for you. They fixed you a plate. You're sitting down. You're ready to enjoy. And just then, the holier-than-thou Christian, we'll call him Pete Pius. Pete Pius comes crashing in on the situation and says, wait, for the love of all things holy, don't eat that meat. I happen to know for sure that sirloin was offered up to Zeus in idol worship. Don't eat that. It'll defile you. So what do you pretty much have to do now? Well, first of all, you do have options, but let's stick first with Paul's recommendation. What do you pretty much need to do at this point? Well, first you try really hard not to roll your eyes at Pete Pius or Helen Holier Than Thou. You try your best not to roll your eyes, and it is tough because they are just sure that they are the more spiritual person here. They are affronted by your carelessness spiritually. They do not realize that they have just identified themselves as the weaker Christian with the weaker conscience. And you can't tell them that, can you? You can't call them on that. You don't want to offend them further. So what do you have to do? You have to try not to roll your eyes. You have to go along with this. And next, what you're going to have to do is you're pretty much going to need to push the plate away and say, thank you very much for preventing me from eating a perfectly suitable and lawful sirloin that I've been smelling at this house as a guest for like 30 minutes and just dying to tear into. Thank you for sparing me from that mistake. And you pretty much have to push the plate away. So one more time, this really is a liberty. I want to stress that because Paul has this right in his writing. He has cleared this as being okay, hasn't he? He's cleared this. You can eat whatever you want. It doesn't matter if it's been offered to an idol. You can eat it. Paul's cleared this. So it really is a liberty. It is truly one of those things that is lawful for you. So if you really want to, you know what you can do to Pete Pius? You can ignore him. You can double down on your liberty. You can eat that Zeus burger or that Mars chop. You can dig in. That is your lawful right as a Christian. You can tell Pete Pius he's wrong. You can take him to the scriptures. You can show him, look, you have an overactive conscience. Your conscience is weak. Mine's biblical. You're the one that's in the wrong here. You can do all of that if you want to. That's completely up to you. And you won't be condemned by God for doing that, no matter what you do here, actually. But if you choose love over liberty, you'll get a reward for sacrificing that meal when you stand before the Lord. And contrary-wise, if you choose your liberty over love here, you will still enter into heaven. You won't be damned for that. And in fact, the Lord might give you a little pat on the back and say, well, thanks for trying to get through to them about liberties. It didn't work, but thanks for trying. But nonetheless, you could stand to lose your reward for what you would otherwise have there for sacrificing that liberty out of love for the sake of another brother or sister. Remember, this all comes back to what Paul was teaching us about running the race, running it well, so that you don't get disqualified from the reward. And that's what he's coming back to right here. You can exercise that liberty if you want. You can run the race how you want to, but just know if you are going to exercise that liberty, knowing that it's offending someone else, then you're losing out. You're missing out on what would otherwise be rewards that are coming to you for those kind of sacrifices, for choosing love, for taking one for the team, for the church, and choosing to please God and be inoffensive, even when you know you're right and you know they're wrong. Choose love over liberty. If you want, choose your liberty over love. You can do that. Paul's recommendation, my recommendation, choose love over your liberty. So apply this to the Disney and Netflix examples that I gave you. You know, you just subscribe to one of those apps. Here comes Pete Pius and Helen Holier Than Thou. Did you know what those companies stand for? And they are oh so happy to educate you on what those companies stand for. What do you got to do now? Well, back to Romans chapter 14, verse 22. You do have some choices. You can choose love over liberty, and you can cancel that subscription. That's the safest option. Because if you do that, there's no chances that Pete Pius and Helen Holier Than Thou are going to find out that you still have those subscriptions. That's the safest bet. If you want to make sure you don't offend that weaker Christian. What's the other option? Romans chapter 14, verse 22. You can choose your liberty over love, but you can do it at least as privately and as secretly as you can. If you're going to have that faith in whatever it is that you're practicing, keep that faith between you and God. Don't let anyone else know about it. I mean, obviously, you know, the folks around you that are okay with it, your wife, your kids, your family, close friends that are on the same page with you, that's fine. But the point is, do everything you can to keep folks from getting offended by things like that you're doing in your life. Reading on in verse 29, and this really does belong with verse 30. It's an unfortunate place to, not break up these verses. It really should be broken up here. But verse 29, finishing it out, it says, "For why should my liberty be determined by someone else's conscience?" Doesn't really feel fair, does it? Why does their weak conscience have to affect me? Why do I have to be the one that's giving in here? Verse 30, "If I partake with thankfulness, why am I denounced because of that for which I give thanks?" And here's ultimately what's going to happen when the weaker brother or sister lets you know they're offended by something and you choose to double down on your liberty and you keep doing it anyway. Here's what it's going to end up doing. It's going to end up causing them to denounce you. This is going to bring out all of the statements like, "I thought you were a Christian. I thought you were really, truly spiritual. But how can you be a Christian? How can you be spiritual? How can you say you love Christ and his church when you're doing this, and I just know that that is a sin against the Lord?" So it's going to bring out a denouncement. Essentially, it's going to ruin your reputation in the eyes of that individual. In Corinth's case, it would be questions like this. Can they really be a Christian if they're buying their meat at the marketplace and indirectly funding pagan worship? Would God be pleased with that? Can you really be a Christian and do that? So we're going to get the same kind of thing. And this is where we want to give our attention to it, that it's not just in our liberties, it's how those liberties come out there. And we have to be concerned not just about our own selves and our edification, but the edification of another person. We have to know, is what I'm doing, is that offending people? And is it ruining my reputation in their eyes? Is it going to cause them to denounce me and discredit me within the church and among other Christians? Those are considerations we must have here. So this is what all of this is about. Let me reread to you these verses, once again, from Romans chapter 14, verses 16 through 21. I've quoted verse 22 a lot. This is verses 16 through 21, and we're almost done here. Paul said this in Romans 14, 16 through 21. "So do not let what you regard as good be evil spoken of. For the kingdom of God is not a matter of eating and drinking." It's not about eating and it's not about food and drink, but of righteousness and peace and joy in the Holy Spirit. "Whoever thus serves Christ is acceptable to God and approved by men. So then let us pursue what makes for peace and for mutual upbuilding or edification. Do not, for the sake of food, destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong, not damnable, but wrong. You're going to end up losing a reward and harming your reputation and offending another Christian. But it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats." Verse 21, "It is not good to eat meat or drink wine," fermented wine, alcohol, "or do anything that causes your brother to stumble." So that's what it all comes down to. If that food was dedicated to Satan himself, you're fine to eat that if you want to. And if that doesn't bother your conscience, you're the stronger Christian. They're the weaker Christian. But for that reason, you're going to have to be the one that brings resolve to this situation. You're going to have to be the level-headed person in that exchange. You're going to need to be the peacemaker there because, again, you can't expect the weaker person to be informed by you and then say instantly, "Oh, okay, I got it now. I see it in the Bible." It instantly stopped bothering my conscience. That's not going to happen. These are weaker Christians with weaker consciences. So we're, as mature saints, every one of us here at Anchored Fellowship, we're going to have to be the bigger people. We're going to have to be the ones that makes that sacrifice, even though we're right. Isn't it tough to be right, to know that you're right, and have someone firmly convinced that you are wrong, and to keep that quiet and to not say anything? Isn't that tough to be quiet in that moment and be the one that goes, "Okay, all right, whatever"? That's tough. And that's what Paul is calling us to here. Now, beginning in verse 30, Paul gives us that 3-step acid test I was telling you about to help us to manage our liberties. We don't need to draw this out. I'll go through this very quickly. I do see what time it is. But it's just a very quick 3-step test to help you determine, first of all, is this genuinely a liberty? And then second of all, if it is, what should I do with it? How should I manage it? He gave us in verse 30, test number 1. It's this: can I give thanks for that liberty? That's a very important test. Can I give thanks for that liberty? If you can genuinely give thanks for that liberty, then it is a liberty. If you can thank God, Lord, thank God that I can eat this, that I can watch this, that I can do this. If you can genuinely do that, it's a liberty. If you can't, then it's not really a liberty. So you can't say, oh, Lord, I'm so thankful for this show and all of the smut it has in it and all of the ungodly lusts and feelings of covetousness that it's causing me. I'm so thankful for that, Lord. Thank you. You can't really do that. You're only fooling yourself in that situation. So that's step number 1, test number 1. Can you really truly be thankful to God for that liberty? If so, it's a liberty. If not, it's not really a liberty, and you need to ditch it. Verse 31, here's the next test. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do all to the glory of God. So test number 2 in verse 31 is this for God's glory? If you're eating, drinking, participating, subscribing, whatever it is that you are doing, are you doing it for the glory of God? Or are you doing it to make your point and rub it into the weaker Christian? Why are you doing it? What's your purpose? And how about abstinence from those liberties? Why are you abstaining from the meat offered to idols? Why are you abstaining from drinking alcohol? Why are you abstaining from watching certain things or subscribing to certain platforms? Why are you doing that? Are you doing it for the glory of God? Or are you doing it to make yourself feel good and to feed your emotion or self-identification in your own self-righteousness? Is it feeding something that's actually negative in you? If you exercise your liberty and the church splits over that, oops, I think you did it wrong. I think you messed up. That wasn't for the glory of God. Verse 32. This is test number 3. Give no offense to Jews or to Greeks or to the church of God. So this is test number 3 in verse 32. Is it offensive or is it potentially offensive? Is this liberty of mine offending others? And we're going to stop right there, but you can see how each one of these people groups could be offended. The Jews would be offended, the unbelieving Jews, offended by you eating meat sacrificed to idols. The pagans, the Gentiles, would be offended if you sat down and said, no, I'm not eating your meat sacrificed to idols. I'm too good for that. That would defile me. And both of those situations can occur within the church because in the church, there are both Jews and Gentiles. All right, let's close with verse 33. Just as I try to please everyone in everything I do, not seeking my own advantage, but that of many, that they may be saved. Paul said a similar thing previously. He said, I become all things to all people so that I might by all means save some. That's the same kind of statement here. I'm just level-headed. I'm just considerate. I'm just polite for the brothers and sisters around me.